everybody, John Papola here. This is actually part 2 of a very long conversation I had with Brett and Heather. Here they are.
The fact is, male and female are different not because somebody imposed these roles on people. It's because the different size of gametes implies a different obligation to invest in offspring, which changes the entire spectrum of how you should think about your hazards and opportunities. And the easiest way to see this is to understand that inside of a plant, many plants have both male and female parts in the same individual. In the case that a flower has male parts and female parts, they disagree over how to view sex with a stranger. The fact is, the female parts are very skeptical of sex with stranger plants, and the pollen parts are enthusiastic about it. That's not for any reason other than the basic asymmetry in those gametes says that this is a sensible way to look at the puzzle. And it has been that way, apparently, for hundreds of millions of years. This has nothing to do with people, nothing to do with oppression. This is just basic biology. And if you don't understand that, you're not even in a position to enter this conversation.
Let me just fill in there. I think you said it, but I'm not sure it's totally clear. Like, why should the male parts be enthusiastic about any sexual opportunity that comes around and the female parts not so much? It goes back to that big difference in the size of the gametes, that each, in the case of plants, grain of pollen cell, is a tiny investment. Send that pollen out to whatever shows up in terms of eggs, and it's not a big cost. If that egg turns out to be a rogue egg or the egg of a plant that's not a very good match, it's not very much of a cost. Whereas the egg, in deciding, we're speaking anthropomorphically here, but in deciding whether or not to accept any given pollen grain, that egg is, for a cell, gigantic. It's already a big investment on the part of the plant. And so eggs are more choosy about what pollen or sperm to accept for fertilization than pollen or sperm is. And that's the gametes. The bodies they're in, the same is true. And there are exceptions. There are sexual reverse species. There is polyandry out there where, there's multiple male mates for a single female, but those are the exceptions. The fundamental original inequality in investment in what the sex gametes are, directly translates into what the basic strategies are, male versus female.
And I would just point out that actually, if you follow this through, that in humans, we have software level adaptations, like, for example, monogamy, that change these basic parameters. When men and women are both investing long-term in partnerships that last a lifetime, in children that they will know and take care of, they become symmetrical in how choosy they are, right? Now, so this allows you to see, are men choosy about mates? Well, they're very choosy when they're looking for a life partner. They're much less choosy when they're looking for something to do for the evening. So that's exactly as you would expect it, based on this underlying biology of the asymmetry in investment that goes all the way back to a difference in gamete size that has nothing to do with people at all.
I mean, the thing that is so, as you were describing the difference in choosiness, I couldn't help but just think about the studies that have shown the radical differences on the swipe platforms, of which my life has been spared, thank the Lord in heaven. Where, the number of choices that a man will swipe, whatever the positive direction is, right, I don't even know, and say oh yeah, no, I like her. Women are many, many multiples more choosy on Tinder and all these platforms than men in comparison in all the studies I've seen about this. I know Chris Williamson talks about this kind of stuff all the time. I am thankfully long married and don't worry about it nearly as much. Monogamy. I want to get to monogamy because you spend time in the book, and it was an area that for your book represented the first time I really heard it through the evolutionary lens in a way that made a lot of sense.
I just want to point out that as much as this may all seem very abstract, you can understand these differences very simply if you think about what should a pollen grain that blows off of a tree and lands on a flower on some other plant do? Should it try to fertilize that other plant? It has exactly nothing to lose, right? It has landed on this other plant, it might as well. What should that female plant think? It should be skeptical because another pollen grain might land that's better. And so it wants to know that that pollen grain is a good match. The asymmetry is right there. The guy trying to figure out what to do with his evening is different than the woman trying to decide whether to engage in a behavior that could constrain her for the next 18 years. And
therefore, of course, birth control changes the analysis.
Radically. It changes it profoundly. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's been a tremendous benefit in women being able to decide how to allocate their efforts and when to produce a family. That has been a major advance of civilization. But it undermined the basic logic that made things work before, which doesn't mean we should go backwards, but it means we should not be surprised that we are living in a world of sexual chaos because we took away one of the fundamentals and we didn't pay very close attention to all the stuff that was connected to it.
Well, instead of encouraging more men to act like women at their best, it has encouraged more women to act like men at their worst. And encouraging either sex to act like the other sex at their worst is obviously not good for any of us.
So it's impossible to hear your description of the pollinators and the male and female plants and not immediately hear like the most stereotypical patterns of, men and women, especially, in their 20s. Why does that pattern survive into human culture in the 21st century? For all the things that are changing, it still does seem to be the case that, men and women behave differently and that they behave in ways that sure rhyme with the plants you're describing. So why is that?
In part, it's actually the reemergence of a pattern because all of the cultural mechanisms for discouraging it have been removed. And that's, it was never gone. But in essence, for almost all of human history, the danger for women of being stuck with offspring and no help raising them was so profound that women themselves and women's families were incentivized to drive up the costs for men behaving badly. And the problem is that birth control lowered the stakes on sex itself, which then robbed the entire logic from the system of mating and dating, and in many ways, the logic of civilization itself, because in the past, it was not a simple thing for a man to find a woman willing to reproduce with him. He had to become worthy of that, and that drove men to accomplish many of the things that men accomplished. At the point that the stakes of sex get lowered, then the motivational structure of civilization is now radically altered, and that has not been a benefit for civilization. It has resulted in a lot of frivolous behavior, and it has resulted in a lot of experimenting with turning sex casual, which is not frankly good for almost anybody. It may be fun, but it does not actually serve men or women in the long run. It ends up producing a kind of hollow existence that many discover too late to do much about it.